Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into one of history's most intoxicating enigmas, the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Picture this, the desert air still warm against your skin, stars spread like glitter over the Euphrates, and before you rises a city of such impossible scale, you almost laugh at the idea of ever finding your way back out. Towering walls, grand gates glazed in blue and gold lions, streets buzzing with languages you don't understand. And somewhere inside this sprawling labyrinth waits a garden so lush, so impossibly green, it seems stolen from another world. You, a weary traveler with sand still clinging to your sandals, are about to slip through its gates. Just be careful, because let's face it, if you accidentally drink the water straight from the river, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love it if you let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle forward into Babylon's midnight streets, the city's pulse alive with night markets and torchlight. The stones beneath your feet are still holding the day's heat, and above you, the smell of roasting meats and pungent spices curls through the air. There's laughter spilling out of doorways, and the faint echo of a reed flute somewhere down a side street. Babylon is not asleep. Babylon is a city that stretches into the dark with restless energy. You're walking toward a mystery whispered about across the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens. The strange thing is, no one you meet on the way seems to describe them quite the same way. Some swear the terraces tower like a mountain, green against the desert sky. Others claim they're tucked discreetly within the palace grounds, a private wonder for royal eyes only. Historians still argue whether the gardens even stood in Babylon at all. But here, in your imagined night walk, you trust the rumors and keep moving closer. The torches along the main street flare, and the famed Ishtar Gate comes into view, a monumental arch glazed with lapis-colored bricks and striding golden bulls. Passing through, you're struck by how the city feels both ancient and strangely modern. The straight streets, the bustling trade, the sense that you are in the beating heart of something enormous. Even modern urban planners might take notes from Nebuchadnezzar's blueprint. And speaking of Nebuchadnezzar II, this is the ruler whose name gets tangled up with the Hanging Gardens most often. He's remembered in clay tablets for fortifying the city, for his military campaigns, for palaces dripping with luxury. The story goes that he built the gardens for his queen, Amytis of Media, who missed the green hills of her homeland. Imagine the gesture. In a land where water itself is precious, a king reorders nature so his wife won't be homesick. Romantic, extravagant, and, let's admit, just a little over the top. Forget flowers on Valentine's Day. Nebuchadnezzar's idea of love language was essentially terraforming. As you pass a stall selling sesame cakes, you can almost believe it. Babylon, after all, was a place of why not thinking. Why not build walls so wide that 2 chariots can race across their tops? Why not make a tower that reaches heaven? why not lift entire rivers into the sky to keep foreign trees alive? Of course, there's the fringe side of the story too. Some later writers claimed the gardens weren't about love at all, but about divine imitation. In their telling, the terraces were crafted as a reflection of a cosmic mountain, the kind gods themselves might descend upon. You might roll your eyes, but in a city where even bricks were inscribed with the king's name to remind you who was boss, the line between devotion and propaganda was as thin as papyrus. You turn down another alley and the scent changes. Less of dust, more of damp earth. Somewhere close by, water is moving where it shouldn't. Babylon was fed by the Euphrates, but this sound is higher, trickling, flowing down unseen stone. You're getting warmer, and you wonder, not for the first time, what kind of engineering insanity it would take to pull this off. Terraces stacked on one another, each strong enough to hold tons of soil and trees. Some accounts mention vaulted stone chambers filled with dirt. Others describe a maze of irrigation channels hidden beneath the greenery. Still others, probably exaggerating, hint that the whole thing rose like a man-made mountain, a ziggurat made of plants instead of bricks. Historians still argue whether these details are descriptions of reality or just ancient hype. But you're not concerned with footnotes right now. You follow the water's murmur, and suddenly the street opens into something uncanny. Shadows of trees where trees shouldn't be, leaves rustling in the desert night. You blink because it seems as if a forest is climbing the walls themselves. Palms sway above stone arches, vines pour downward like waterfalls, and the torchlight flickers on an impossible sight. The hanging gardens stretch upward, tier after tier, an oasis suspended in air. Birds circle lazily between the terraces, and somewhere up there you hear the playful splash of water cascading from one level to the next. The scent is intoxicating: damp soil, jasmine, resin, and the faint perfume of figs ripening overhead. In this place, the desert is banished. Here, the earth itself has been persuaded to bloom against its will. You feel suddenly small, like you've stumbled into someone's dream made real. A dream that, inconveniently, might never have existed at all. But tonight, with the stars over Babylon and the gardens shimmering like a mirage, you'll believe. You linger in the shadow of the terraces, wondering how such a miracle began. To understand, you have to step back into the story of Nebuchadnezzar II, the man most often credited with giving Babylon its mythical gardens. Picture him, a king of kings, ruling in the 6th century BCE, a man whose very name once made rivals hesitate. He wasn't just building palaces, he was carving his name into history with every brick, every wall, every temple, and apparently with every plant too. The legend says it all started with love, or at least a clever way to keep the queen from sulking. Amytis of Media, Nebuchadnezzar's wife, came from the rolling green hills of what is now northwestern Iran. Babylon, by contrast, was flat, hot, and dry. Imagine being uprooted from mountain breezes and wild forests and dropped into a furnace where shade was more precious than silver. Amytis missed home, and Nebuchadnezzar, like any spouse trying to avoid endless complaints, decided to do something about it. Of course, when you're the king of the most powerful empire in the world, your version of doing something means commissioning one of the 7 wonders. It's a touching idea, isn't it? A husband conjuring a paradise to soothe his wife's homesickness. Historians still argue whether this story is fact, courtly propaganda, or just the ancient world's idea of good PR. But there's something irresistible in imagining Nebuchadnezzar pacing the palace, muttering to himself, "Happy wife, happy life, even if it costs me an entire river system." What's certain is that Nebuchadnezzar II had the resources to make such madness possible. His reign turned Babylon into a jewel of Mesopotamia. He expanded the city's walls until they wrapped the capital like an impenetrable embrace. He ordered temples reconstructed with glazed bricks that glittered in the sun. He raised the Ishtar Gate, a colossal entrance painted deep blue and covered with lions and dragons. If any king was going to laugh in the face of desert drought and build a hanging forest, it was this one. Still, you can't help but imagine the logistical headaches. Forget dealing with one picky gardener. This project would have required entire teams of engineers, water experts, masons, and laborers hauling soil day after day. Some tablets suggest Nebuchadnezzar had a special interest in canals and waterworks, and perhaps this is where the first seeds of the garden plan were planted. After all, Mesopotamian kings weren't just warriors, they were water managers. In a land that lived and died by the flood cycles of the Euphrates and Tigris, controlling water was the same as controlling destiny. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. Some fringe stories insist Nebuchadnezzar built the gardens not for his wife, but for himself, because he was fascinated by exotic plants. Supposedly, he liked surrounding himself with trees and flowers from distant lands, almost like a collector hoarding rare trading cards, only heavier and leafier. You can imagine a royal servant nervously explaining to foreign merchants, yes, His Majesty is very keen on acquiring another cedar tree. No, I don't know why. Yes, we'll pay for shipping. But before you laugh too hard, consider the symbolic weight. In Mesopotamian tradition, kings proved their power by taming chaos, bending nature to their will. Building an artificial mountain covered in greenery wasn't just about personal taste or a homesick queen. It was a statement. I command not only nations, but the desert itself. And if that sounds like overcompensation, well, you try running an empire with enemies on every border and see how calm you feel. As you drift through this thought, you notice how quiet the city around the gardens has become. The further you walk into the greenery, the more distant Babylon's noise seems. The hum of markets, the calls of merchants, even the clatter of chariot wheels fade away. Instead, you hear frogs chirping from hidden pools, the creak of tree branches shifting overhead. Somewhere above you, a gardener murmurs to himself in Akkadian as he adjusts a water channel. It's strange. You're standing in one of the busiest capitals of the ancient world, but here it feels like a mountain retreat. And maybe that was exactly the point. Amytis wanted hills. Nebuchadnezzar gave her an entire artificial one, layered in terraces, topped with trees, and fed with the river's lifeblood. Of course, there's always the skeptical voice whispering, did any of this actually happen? Some historians argue the whole love story is a later invention, a neat tale dreamed up by Greek writers who liked their wonders wrapped in romance. They point out that Babylonian records, painstaking lists of buildings, temples, and projects Nebuchadnezzar bragged about, never once mention a hanging garden. That's suspicious, isn't it? Why leave out your biggest brag? Unless it never existed at all. But here, in the hush of torchlight and shadow, with the fragrance of cypress rising around you, you decide not to argue. After all, sometimes legends survive because they offer something more beautiful than truth. And in a way, the very act of believing makes the garden bloom a little brighter. You climb one of the stone steps carved into the terrace base, placing your hand against blocks still warm from the day's heat. Somewhere above, Amytis might once have stood, gazing at her manufactured mountain, inhaling the green breath of trees that shouldn't survive here. Whether or not it really happened, the story holds. And in this dreamlike walk, that's enough. You steady yourself on the wide step, and when you lift your eyes, the terraces loom above you like a staircase built for gods. One level rises into another, each one a platform thick with soil, overflowing with life. From down here, the effect is dizzying. It really does look like the gardens are hanging, defying gravity, spilling down in layers of vines and branches. It's not a manicured palace courtyard where every rosebush sits politely in a row. No, this is wild, abundant, like someone scooped up an entire forest and dropped it onto Babylon's shoulders. The first sensation that hits you is the scent. It's a humid mix of earth and water, a shock after the dust-dry air of the streets. You breathe it in, notes of pine, crushed herbs, and sweet blossoms. It smells like rain that never fell here, like mountain breezes bottled and uncorked in the desert. If perfumes today come with names like fresh mist or wild forest, this place already nailed the formula thousands of years ago. And then the sounds, water gurgling unseen, a trickle spilling down a stone spout, a splash of droplets hitting lower pools. Birds chatter somewhere up high, their calls echoing faintly off the brick walls. A frog croaks, bold as a street vendor, reminding you that not all Babylonian imports were glamorous. Mixed with it all is the whisper of leaves brushing against each other, a sound that makes you want to close your eyes and drift off right here on the steps. You climb higher, past stone arches half swallowed in foliage. Under one, you glimpse what could be a vaulted chamber, dark, cool, with roots snaking through cracks. Imagine the hidden world beneath your feet. Massive foundations, possibly filled with dirt, possibly with water channels. Historians still argue whether these vaults were structural genius or just myths misremembered by later storytellers. But up here on the terraces, you're less interested in blueprints than in textures. The walls feel damp under your palm, slick with moss. The soil underfoot squishes softly, proof of irrigation. Pigeons burst from a fig tree as you brush past, their wings startling in the moonlight. You notice fruit trees heavy with promise, pomegranates like glowing lanterns, figs dark and sticky sweet, dates clustered high on palms. Somewhere, vines dangle with unripe grapes, and you wonder what Babylonian wine might taste like, probably strong enough to make you forget the sandstorms. And the Imagine bright lilies peeking out of stone crevices, jasmine curling around columns, and maybe even imported roses from distant lands. One ancient writer described exotic plants hanging down the walls, hence the famous name. You picture a gardener grumbling as he ties yet another vine to keep it from smothering a stairway, muttering, "Why couldn't the queen just settle for a few potted plants?" Here's a quirky tidbit. Some fringe theories suggest the gardens doubled as a kind of ancient zoo, where birds and even small animals roamed free among the greenery. It's not impossible. Babylonians were skilled at collecting and displaying exotic creatures. You can almost see a peacock strutting arrogantly across a terrace, unimpressed by all this human effort. Yet there's a deliberate artistry to the arrangement. These aren't random clusters of greenery. They're staged to mimic a mountain, a vertical illusion of nature designed to trick the senses into believing you've escaped the flat horizon of Mesopotamia. It's theater, but with trees instead of actors. And isn't that what humans have always done? Take what nature gives us and rearrange it into spectacle. Historians still argue whether the word hanging meant suspended in the air or simply overhanging like balconies of greenery. Maybe these terraces weren't sky-high wonders at all, but lower, sprawling courtyards with plants drooping over walls. But right now, staring up at the endless layers, it doesn't matter. The illusion works. The desert is gone, and you've stepped into a dream someone else built centuries ago. You pause near a small fountain where water drips into a stone basin. The surface reflects torchlight, rippling like liquid stars. You scoop some with your hand, let it trickle over your fingers, and feel the coolness. This is the miracle, you realize. Not the stones, not the trees, but the water. Water lifted, channeled, coaxed into flowing where it shouldn't. Babylon has bent the river into a song, and the garden is the chorus. The thought makes you smile. You're standing in the middle of what may be the most expensive love letter ever written. Half wilderness, half engineering marvel. And whether or not the details line up with dusty scrolls, the experience feels as real as the earth beneath your sandals. As you lean against the terrace wall, a breeze stirs the branches, and for just a moment, you swear you hear laughter. Soft, distant, maybe the queen herself strolling through her garden centuries ago. Or maybe it's just the birds. Either way, you let the sound carry you deeper into the night. You tilt your head back, following the arc of water tumbling down from one terrace to another, and you can't help asking the question every visitor must have whispered to themselves. How on earth did they get the river up here? It's one thing to stack bricks into a wall, another to lay stone upon stone into a tower. But water is slippery, stubborn. It wants to run down, not climb up. And yet here you stand, damp air on your cheeks, listening to streams chuckle their way down the steps of a garden suspended in the sky. The Euphrates is close, its broad, muddy ribbon flowing right through Babylon. But the terraces rise far above the riverbank. Bringing water up to the top would have required technology that frankly sounds more like wizardry than gardening. And yet the ancients were nothing if not inventive. Some say Nebuchadnezzar's engineers used the shadoof, a simple device you might still spot along Middle Eastern fields today. A long pole with a bucket at one end, counterweighted with a stone at the other. You dip the bucket, haul the pole down, let the weight yank it back up, like a seesaw scooping liquid sky. Multiply that by hundreds of sweaty workers lined up along the walls, and maybe, just maybe, you'd have enough water sloshing upward to keep palms alive. But imagine the effort. It would take an army of bucket haulers to keep a mountain of greenery from wilting. Historians still argue whether such a system could sustain something on this scale, which is why another theory gets floated: the Archimedes screw, a spiral-shaped device that lifts water as you turn it. The catch: Archimedes lived centuries later in Greece. Either someone invented a Babylonian version first, or the story traveled backward in time like an anachronistic cameo. Still, it's not impossible. Civilizations sometimes stumble across the same idea twice. Then there's the more elegant idea of the chain pump. Picture buckets fastened to a loop of chain, running over wheels like a conveyor belt. As the chain turns, the buckets dip into the river, scoop water, and carry it up to a reservoir. Gravity then takes over, sending streams trickling down channels cut into the terraces. It sounds plausible, mechanical, continuous, less dependent on workers collapsing from heat stroke, and clay tablets from later Assyrian times describe just such contraptions. Could Babylon have borrowed the trick earlier? Scholars debate it endlessly, and while they argue, you walk along a narrow stone channel, watching water snake its way past you. The engineering feels invisible, hidden in plain sight. Pipes may be baked clay, sealed with bitumen, a sticky black tar that clings to everything like the world's oldest duct tape. It smells faintly sharp, and you imagine the builders cursing as it dripped onto their sandals. The Babylonians used it for boats, for walls, and possibly here too, to keep their elevated aqueduct from leaking like a cracked jar. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some fringe storytellers once suggested the water wasn't hauled at all, but conjured by hidden springs bubbling inside the palace mound. An underground miracle, like the earth itself lending a hand. There's no evidence for it, of course, but wouldn't it be neat? Instead of pumps and gears, the garden would simply be plugged straight into nature's plumbing. As you reach a higher terrace, the proof of water's success spreads out before you. Ferns shimmering under torchlight, pools where tiny fish dart, damp moss clinging to stone. You crouch near a cascade spilling into a shallow trough, and the cool spray hits your face. In a desert where most people ration water by the jug, this feels like decadence beyond measure. And you realize the garden wasn't just for the queen or for royal romance. It was for awe. Anyone stepping into this oasis, envoys, rivals, weary travelers like you, would instantly see what Babylon wanted them to see. Here is a kingdom so powerful it can order rivers to climb uphill. Historians still argue whether this level of hydraulic engineering was even possible in Nebuchadnezzar's time. Some say the evidence points to later Assyrian kings perfecting the art, not Babylonians. But standing here, watching water dance down stones, the debate feels irrelevant. The builders of the ancient Near East were geniuses of irrigation. They built canals that stretched like veins across their empires. they turned swamps into farmland. They coaxed crops from stubborn soil. If anyone could trick the Euphrates into flowing skyward, it was them. You trace the channel with your hand, following its path as it forks into smaller rivulets, feeding planters, soaking roots. The system hums like a hidden heartbeat, unseen but essential. Without it, the terraces would crumble into dust and the legend would wither. With it, the gardens rise eternal, a defiance carved in water and stone. And you can't help but think, next time someone complains about their backyard sprinkler system, remind them that Nebuchadnezzar's gardeners had to irrigate an entire mountain by hand. Perspective, right? You pause at the edge of a terrace and look out, not just at the greenery surrounding you, but beyond the walls of the garden itself. Babylon stretches in every direction, a living canvas of stone, mud brick, and light. The gardens might be the jewel, but the setting, the city itself, is the frame. Without it, the wonder would lose half its meaning. From this high perch, the Euphrates River glimmers below, reflecting the moon like a silver ribbon twisting through the city. Barges drift silently on its surface, weighted with reeds, grain, and pottery. The river is Babylon's artery, its source of trade, food, and life. And now, thanks to the hanging gardens, its water is also transformed into spectacle. You lean on the stone balustrade and imagine being a visiting envoy from some distant kingdom, stepping off a boat to see not only towering walls, but behind them, trees improbably waving above rooftops. Talk about a power flex. The walls themselves are staggering. Ancient sources claimed they stretched so far and so thick that chariots could ride abreast on top of them. Historians still argue whether those numbers were exaggerated, because let's be real, the ancients weren't shy about padding their Yelp reviews. But the scale is undeniable. Even broken, even weathered by time, the remains of Babylon's fortifications hint at a city determined to keep the desert and its enemies firmly at bay. To your left, you can almost trace the route of the processional way, the grand boulevard cutting through the city. During festivals, statues of gods would parade along it, carried on the shoulders of priests, while citizens cheered and musicians filled the air with cymbals and drums. And at its northern end rises the Ishtar Gate, glazed in cobalt blue tiles and shining with lions, bulls, and dragons. The animals march in frozen procession, symbols of strength and divine guardianship. When you picture the gardens framed against this backdrop, the gate, the boulevard, the river, you begin to understand why Babylon was once the synonym for grandeur. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that Babylon's urban planners included designated beer streets, lined with taverns where thick, porridge-like beer was served through long straws. Imagine stumbling out of one of those after a festival, looking up and seeing what looks like a jungle hovering above the rooftops. You might swear off drinking for good, or at least until the next festival rolled around. The deeper truth, though, is that the gardens didn't stand apart from the city. They embodied it. Babylon was a metropolis of contrasts, ordered streets against wild markets, rigid brickwork against flowing river, desert heat against sudden shade. The hanging gardens mirrored that duality, a carefully engineered wilderness stitched into the heart of urban sprawl. From here, you notice how the city hums even at night. Fires flicker on rooftops where families gather to cool off after blistering days. The scent of roasted lamb drifts upward. Somewhere, a temple drum beats slow and steady, a reminder that even as you lose yourself in the dreamlike greenery, Babylon's gods are never far away. And that's another layer. These gardens may not have been just a romantic gesture, but also a sacred one. Some scholars speculate the terraces echoed the image of a ziggurat, the stepped temples meant to bridge heaven and earth. Hanging plants pouring down stone levels would have made that symbolism hard to miss. Historians still argue whether the gardens were tucked inside the palace complex itself, an exclusive paradise for royals and priests, or positioned where they could be glimpsed by citizens and travelers alike. If the latter, then every boat gliding down the Euphrates would have caught sight of them, shimmering against the skyline, a city selling itself not just as powerful, but as paradise made manifest. Babylon wasn't just a capital, it was a brand, and branding mattered. Empires rise and fall, but their monuments linger in memory. Just as Paris flaunts the Eiffel Tower or New York boasts its skyline, Babylon flaunted gardens that seemed to suspend nature itself in midair. You wonder how many foreign envoys reported back home, breathless. They have rivers in the sky. Do not mess with these people. The city stretches on, endless mud brick houses, courtyards filled with goats, merchants arguing over copper prices, scribes hunched over clay tablets under flickering lamps. Babylon was no utopia. It was noisy, dusty, human. And yet above it all, the hanging gardens whispered a different reality. Lush, cool, ordered, eternal. A reminder that even amid the chaos of markets and wars, someone had dared to dream of a mountain of green. As you lean against the warm stone and let the city's pulse wash over you, you can't help smiling. Because for all the uncertainty, for all the scholarly debates standing here in this imagined night, Babylon feels alive. And the gardens, rather than a separate wonder, feel like the city's heart, its secret beating high above the streets. You wander deeper along the terraces, the hush of water and rustle of leaves broken now by something else, the murmur of voices, not real ones, but echoes of writers from centuries past. The hanging gardens are not remembered through stone alone, but through words. And those words, scattered across time like petals on the river, often disagree with each other in the most baffling ways. The first whisper comes from Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in the 3rd century BCE. He described the gardens as Nebuchadnezzar's gift to Amytis, the homesick queen. His account reads like a royal romance etched into clay. It's neat, tidy, and satisfying. The problem? Berossus lived 2 centuries after Nebuchadnezzar. Think of it as writing a Yelp review of a restaurant you've only heard about from your great-great-grandparents. Authentic? Maybe. Precise? Probably not. Then there's Herodotus, the famous Greek historian often called the father of history, and occasionally the father of lies, depending on whom you ask. He wrote extensively about Babylon, detailing its massive walls and busy streets. But here's the kicker. He never once mentions the hanging gardens. Not a whisper. If the gardens were truly a wonder of the ancient world, how could Herodotus miss them? Historians still argue whether this silence means the gardens didn't exist yet, or if Herodotus just got distracted by Babylon's taverns and forgot to take notes. A century later, Strabo and Quintus Curtius Rufus stepped in, adding their own takes. Strabo spoke of vaulted terraces watered by screw pumps, his words painting a vivid mechanical picture. Rufus claimed the gardens were like a mountain, rising with terraces stacked upon one another. Yet their accounts, too, were centuries after the fact, filtered through layers of retelling, rumor, and maybe even a dash of ancient travel writing flair. You stop beside a pool where moonlight glimmers across the surface, and you imagine each ripple as another contradictory detail. Some writers insist the gardens stood within the palace walls. Others place them by the riverbank. Some say they were small but exquisite. Others describe them as towering, monumental. You can almost hear the scribes squabbling like rival bloggers. Trust me, I saw it myself. Oh, please, your cousin's friend's uncle told you that. Here's a quirky tidbit. One obscure account claimed the gardens were so damp and shaded that crocodiles occasionally ended up in the pools, smuggled in with shipments of exotic plants. Imagine strolling along, admiring lilies, when suddenly, snap, not exactly the paradise you pictured. It's almost certainly nonsense, but it does highlight how myths grow wild once they leave their roots. The contradictions only deepen the mystery. If all these sources can't agree, what exactly were they describing? A single real structure, half remembered and exaggerated. Multiple gardens across Mesopotamia, their details fused together? Or nothing at all, just a legend born of envy and imagination? Historians still argue whether these reports were eyewitness accounts or literary inventions designed to awe Greek and Roman readers hungry for exotic tales. You wander through an archway, imagining each ancient writer as a phantom guide at your side. Berossus points to a lush tree and insists it was grown from Median soil. Strabo taps his chin and sketches water screws in the air. Herodotus shrugs and says, "What gardens?" Rufus waves grandly at the terraces as though describing a palace of Olympus. The chorus of voices overlaps, each one certain, each one flawed. And maybe that's the secret charm of the hanging gardens. They live not in stone foundations or excavated ruins, but in this cacophony of human memory. The fact that no two stories match only makes the vision richer. The gardens hang not just from terraces of brick, but from the fragile scaffolding of imagination. You lean against a damp wall, listening to the splash of a small cascade, and smile at the thought. If the gardens were designed to dazzle visitors, they succeeded beyond measure, not just in their time, but for millennia afterward. They planted themselves into stories, grew across languages, blossomed in every retelling. Like ivy creeping across stone, they wrap themselves around the human mind, ensuring that even if the roots are gone, the legend keeps climbing. And here you are, centuries later, wandering the dream, still caught in its spell. You climb to another terrace, the air growing cooler as night breezes weave through the leaves. From here, you glance northward, beyond Babylon, beyond the Euphrates, and you find yourself pulled into another possibility entirely. What if this garden, this so-called wonder of Babylon, never stood here at all? What if the true hanging gardens were not Babylonian, but Assyrian, planted hundreds of miles away in the city of Nineveh? It sounds like historical heresy, but the idea has grown roots. The champion of this theory is none other than Sennacherib, the Assyrian king who ruled a century before Nebuchadnezzar. Sennacherib left behind inscriptions bragging about a palace without rival and gardens watered by ingenious machines. He boasted of bringing plants and trees from every corner of his empire to create a lush landscape within the walls of Nineveh. His words drip with pride, like a gardener showing off his tomatoes to neighbors, except his tomatoes were cedar trees and exotic fruit groves in the middle of Mesopotamia. What makes this theory juicy is the detail. Sennacherib described an irrigation system powered by something suspiciously like the Archimedes screw centuries before Archimedes was even born. He called it a wonder for all peoples, designed to lift water from the Tigris into aqueducts that fed his gardens. Archaeologists in the 20th century even uncovered parts of these aqueducts near modern-day Mosul, massive stone channels carrying water across valleys, complete with inscriptions crediting Sennacherib. That's not myth, that's brick and stone evidence. You pause at a balustrade, listening to Babylon's fountains splash below, and the thought itches. Maybe the Greeks and later writers simply got the city wrong. Maybe they heard tales of a breathtaking green mountain in Mesopotamia and assumed it must be in the region's superstar capital, Babylon. After all, if you'd never been to Mesopotamia, wouldn't you mix up cities too? It's like confusing Hollywood with Broadway. Different places, similar vibes of spectacle. Here's a quirky tidbit. In one of his inscriptions, Sennacherib bragged that he had invented water-raising machines so advanced that future generations would marvel at them. Historians still argue whether this was an early version of the screw pump, a chain-driven system, or something else entirely. But the man clearly wanted credit for innovation. Imagine him side-eyeing Nebuchadnezzar across time, muttering, "Excuse me, those were my gardens." So why then does the legend stick to Babylon? Perhaps because Nebuchadnezzar's city was already larger than life in Greek imagination. Babylon had the walls, the tower, the drama. Nineveh, by contrast, had the misfortune of being utterly destroyed in 612 BCE, burned, looted, flattened. By the time Greek historians came along, Babylon was still standing, bustling, and photogenic. Nineveh was dust, and dust doesn't make headlines. Still, when you picture the hanging gardens now, your mind splits in two. On one side, Amytis sighing happily as Nebuchadnezzar's terraces remind her of home. On the other, Sennacherib strutting through his aqueduct-fed paradise, smugly pointing out how his water machines never jammed. Two rival kings, two rival cities, one floating legend. Historians still argue whether we should officially rename the wonder the Hanging Gardens of Nineveh. Some have even suggested textbooks should swap the label entirely. But traditions cling like ivy, and Babylon's name refuses to let go. For most of the world, the Hanging Gardens will always rise above the Euphrates, whether or not they ever sprouted here. You stroll along a shaded walkway, letting this rivalry wash over you. In one version, you are in Babylon, inhaling jasmine and figs above the Ishtar Gate. In another, you are in Nineveh, standing on a terrace overlooking the Tigris, marveling at aqueducts stretching like giant stone arms across the horizon. Both visions shimmer, both convincing, both impossible to prove. And maybe that's the real trick. The Hanging Gardens were never about one city, one king, one set of bricks. They were about the human urge to imagine paradise wherever we stand. As the night deepens, you breathe in the mingled scent of earth and myth and smile, because whether you're in Babylon or Nineveh, the wonder feels the same. You step higher, the terraces narrowing now, and the city beyond seems to shrink under the velvet cloak of night. From this perch, your gaze drifts to the horizon, where the moon casts silver across the Euphrates, and you think of the lifeblood flowing unseen through the bricks beneath your feet. Water engineering. Without it, these gardens, whether in Babylon or Nineveh, would have been as lifeless as a cactus in the Arctic. Picture it, an arid Mesopotamian plain, the sun scorching down like a cosmic heat lamp. And yet here, in the midst of it all, thrives a lush oasis. This was no accident. It was the result of ingenuity so bold that even today engineers scratch their heads. How did they keep these trees alive, perched high on stone terraces, far above the natural flow of the river? Ancient sources whisper about screw pumps, machines that drew water upward. Strabo described them as devices operated by men who walked endlessly inside wheels, like hamsters powering an eternal garden. Imagine being one of those poor souls. Hey Mom, guess what? I got a job watering the king's plants. Oh yeah, it involves walking uphill in circles for 16 hours. You probably wouldn't survive long on that career path. Archaeologists also point to canals and aqueducts. In fact, fragments of stone channels stretching over the land still bear inscriptions from Sennacherib bragging about his hydraulic genius. They diverted rivers, funneled streams, and even built reservoirs to store precious water. Historians still argue whether Babylon itself had anything comparable, since the Euphrates flowed right through the city. Maybe they built clever sluices to guide the water upward, or perhaps they employed animal-powered lifts. Or maybe, just maybe, the real high-tech plumbing belonged to Nineveh all along. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some fringe theories claim they used bronze chain pumps with buckets attached, turning endlessly to scoop water into higher basins. One scholar even suggested that oxen-powered treadmills connected to gears, basically the Mesopotamian version of a gym membership for cows. It's far-fetched, but then again, so is a jungle sprouting in the desert. You lean over a railing and imagine the system working in rhythm. Below, a channel carved into stone feeds water to a cistern. Men or animals power the lifts, raising water step by step into hidden reservoirs. From there, it trickles down across terraces, seeping through baked bricks and channels lined with bitumen. Every drop is precious, every trickle carefully guided. Too much, and the terraces collapse into mud. Too little, and the queen's flowers wilt. The balance had to be exact, an ancient game of irrigation Jenga. What fascinates you most is how the ancients didn't just build walls and temples. They built moving, breathing systems. This wasn't just architecture, it was ecology. Each terrace required drainage to prevent flooding, each vault reinforced to bear soil's crushing weight. Modern architects sometimes shake their heads in disbelief. We struggle to keep green roofs alive today, and they were doing this 2,500 years ago. But historians still argue whether we're underestimating or overestimating them. Were these truly advanced machines, or are we projecting our own fascination with technology onto the past? Maybe the secret was simpler. Vast armies of workers carrying buckets day after day. Not glamorous, but effective, like realizing the magic of your grandma's secret recipe is just an extra spoon of sugar. You trail your fingers along the damp stone, feeling the ghost of that hydraulic heartbeat. Imagine standing here in summer when Babylon streets shimmered under the sun, yet the gardens stayed cool, mist rising from fountains, vines heavy with dew. People below must have looked up in awe, wondering how the king had commanded the sky to rain only on his palace. The hanging gardens, whether here or in Nineveh, were more than a symbol of love or power. They were a testament to humanity's endless thirst to bend nature, to bring rivers into the sky. And as you listen to the quiet drip of unseen water, you realize the true wonder wasn't the plants at all. It was the plumbing. You stroll along another pathway where vines dangle like curtains and the shadows of pomegranate branches sway above. But your mind drifts from bricks and water wheels to the invisible layer beneath every wonder, symbolism. The hanging gardens were never just a fancy greenhouse. They were a political statement, a cultural flex, and maybe even a spiritual symbol wrapped in greenery. Think first of Nebuchadnezzar, if the Babylonian version is true. His empire sprawled, his walls rose like mountains, and his ziggurats scraped the sky. But what better crown to his city than a paradise of trees and flowers, a living reminder that his power stretched far beyond deserts. Imagine foreign envoys walking into Babylon, sweating from the heat, only to be ushered into a shaded oasis with fig trees swaying above waterfalls. The message was clear. This king can bend even the climate to his will. It was propaganda, but the fragrant, leafy kind. Now think of Queen Amytis. The gardens, as the legend goes, were for her, a transplanted bride from the greener lands of Media. Homesick, longing for the mountains of her childhood, she received from her husband a living replica of her homeland. Romantic, absolutely, but also strategic. Marriages between empires were often shaky alliances. What better way to keep peace than to literally recreate a piece of your wife's home in your capital? Talk about relationship goals. Yet, if you shift the lens to Assyria and Sennacherib, the meaning changes. His inscriptions describe not just a palace, but a garden designed to showcase the divine order he claimed to maintain. Kings often styled themselves as gardeners of their empires, tending, pruning, watering. A lush terrace bursting with exotic plants wasn't just pretty, it was a statement that he could control both nature and nations. And when he bragged about inventing water machines, it wasn't only engineering pride, it was a claim to godlike creativity. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some scholars suggest the gardens symbolized the cosmic mountain, a sacred motif in Mesopotamian culture. Many ancient temples were built as stepped ziggurats. meant to represent the bridge between earth and heaven. The hanging gardens, rising tier upon tier, may have echoed that same cosmic image, except instead of bricks alone, they sprouted with life. Imagine walking up each level, climbing not only toward the sky, but toward the divine. A holy pilgrimage disguised as a horticultural stroll. Historians still argue whether the gardens were meant more for show or for ritual. Were they a public display of imperial wealth, or a private sanctuary where the king and queen communed with the gods? The lack of clarity only thickens the vines of mystery. And here's where the symbolism gets juicy. The word paradise itself, derived from Old Persian paradisa, literally meant walled garden. To the ancients, a lush, enclosed garden was the very definition of heaven on earth. The hanging gardens may have been the closest thing to paradise humans had ever built. When later writers described them, perhaps they weren't just recording architecture, they were painting the idea of heaven itself. You pause beside a pool where moonlight glitters on the water, and for a moment the symbolism becomes personal. Maybe the gardens weren't just propaganda or theology. Maybe they were also about the universal human longing for escape. To stand in the desert heat, then step into cool shade, is to feel you've entered another world. That's why the story still captivates us, not because we need proof of bricks, but because we understand the yearning they represent. And as you walk, you can't help but grin, because if you strip away the politics and the myths, the hanging gardens were, at heart, one big flex. The ancient version of posting a photo on Instagram captioned, "Just chilling in my private mountain paradise, watered by my army of engineers." King life. You drift along the terrace, the stone cool beneath your palms, and the night air heavy with the fragrance of jasmine. But suddenly the silence is broken, not by fountains or birdsong, but by the distant hum of voices. Not ancient scribes this time, but the bustling, dust-covered chatter of modern archaeologists crouched in trenches and brushing soil from forgotten bricks. Because if the gardens were real, surely we'd have dug them up by now, right? Archaeology has been poking around Mesopotamia for nearly 2 centuries, and Babylon was one of the earliest obsessions. In the 19th century, explorers arrived with shovels, sketchbooks, and the Victorian equivalent of Indiana Jones swagger. They uncovered walls so thick a chariot could ride atop them, fragments of the Ishtar Gate, and cuneiform tablets stacked like ancient hard drives. But no trace of lush vaulted terraces, no flower beds, no irrigation pipes, no "Welcome to the Hanging Gardens" sign, just dusty ruins and disappointed sighs. That gap in evidence has fueled the Nineveh theory, because in the mid-20th century, archaeologists working near modern Mosul uncovered something extraordinary: the remains of an enormous stone aqueduct built by Sennacherib. It stretched for miles, carrying water across valleys on carved channels, and even featuring carved stone alligators for decoration, because apparently engineering alone wasn't dramatic enough. Inscriptions on the aqueduct literally brag about bringing water to gardens. For many, this feels like the smoking gun. But Babylon still refuses to yield its secrets. Some suggest the Euphrates' constant shifting has buried remains deep below the water table, unreachable by modern digs. Others argue that mud brick construction simply eroded away over centuries, leaving little more than whispers. And historians still argue whether we've just been looking in the wrong spot all along, like trying to find your car keys when they're actually in the fridge. Here's a quirky tidbit. In the 1800s, one British archaeologist swore he found vaulted cellars near Babylon's palace ruins that might have supported the gardens. He promptly published his claim, only for later experts to point out that the cellars were actually ancient storehouses for grain. Not quite as romantic. Imagine expecting hanging vines and instead finding moldy wheat. The truth is, Mesopotamian archaeology is messy. Cities were built, destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again, layer upon layer, like a lasagna of history. Fires, floods, and looting scrambled everything further. The Hanging Gardens may have been dismantled stone by stone, their bricks repurposed for humbler projects like someone's goat pen. The wonder of the world could literally be hiding in a farmer's courtyard wall. And still, the dream drives spades into soil. Satellite imagery now scans the landscape, picking up faint lines where canals once ran. Drones sweep over ruins, mapping what human eyes might miss. Some archaeologists remain stubbornly optimistic that one day we'll uncover definitive traces, perhaps root pits carved into terraces or clay tablets describing irrigation schedules. Until then, the gardens remain half science, half bedtime story. You stand on the terrace, gazing at the stars while modern voices fade into the night. Their shovels, their dust, their debates, all are part of the same chorus as the ancient scribes. Some claim to have found proof, others wave their hands and shrug, and meanwhile, the gardens remain elusive. And maybe that's fitting. Wonders aren't meant to be pinned down like butterflies in a display case. They're meant to hang, suspended between soil and sky, fact and imagination. The night deepens, and as you wander further, the terrace is quiet until it feels like you're the last soul awake in the entire city. That stillness invites a different kind of wondering. Not about bricks or irrigation, but about plants. Because what exactly bloomed here? If this was a garden of marvels, then its palette of leaves and petals must have been as breathtaking as its architecture. Start with the basics. The soil of Mesopotamia already supported date palms, figs, and pomegranates. Dates were the lifeblood of the region, eaten fresh, dried, or fermented into wine. Figs provided sweetness, while pomegranates symbolized fertility with their jewel-like seeds. You picture them hanging heavy from branches, ripe enough to stain your fingertips. These trees alone would make the terraces fragrant and colorful. But the legend insists the gardens overflowed with exotic imports. Imagine cedars transplanted from Lebanon, their evergreen scent filling the air. Imagine almonds, apricots, and olives hauled across deserts, or roses and lilies carried in clay pots from faraway lands. Some even suggest that cinnamon and frankincense trees were planted, their spicy fragrance perfuming the night air. Historians still argue whether such delicate species could survive Babylon's climate, or whether ancient gardeners really had the know-how to coax them into thriving on elevated terraces. Here's a quirky tidbit. One fringe theory claims that grapevines dangled over the terraces, their clusters ripening in the sun, turning the garden into a natural winery. If true, you can bet Nebuchadnezzar or Sennacherib threw some legendary rooftop parties, ancient equivalent of a rooftop bar with unlimited cocktails, though the DJ would have been a harpist with a sore back. The sheer logistics of this horticultural zoo boggle the mind. Plants don't just grow wherever you plop them. Soil had to be hauled in by the ton, carefully layered with waterproofing bitumen to keep it from collapsing. The terraces needed drainage to prevent root rot, and those exotic imports, they had to be acclimatized, coddled, watered, shaded, and pampered like celebrity guests. Imagine gardeners sprinting around with clay pots and watering cans, muttering, "Don't you dare die on me, little fig tree." Yet for all the effort, the payoff would have been dazzling. Picture yourself standing on one terrace at dawn, looking out over a sea of green spilling downward in terraces, palms swaying in the breeze, blossoms glowing pink and white, vines draping over stone, and the soft hum of bees chasing nectar. Below, the dusty streets of Babylon. Above, an illusion of mountains transplanted into the flat plain. Some scholars even wonder if medicinal plants grew here. Herbs like coriander, cumin, or licorice. The garden might have doubled as a pharmacy, blending luxury with practicality. Others suggest rare species were displayed like living trophies, proof that the king's reach extended to lands so far-flung even their flora bowed to him. The garden wasn't just beautiful, it was political botany. Historians still argue whether this collection was sustainable. Did the gardens last centuries, or just a few decades before roots cracked the terraces and plants withered? Were they maintained by generations of gardeners, or did they vanish the moment imperial attention drifted elsewhere? No one knows. But as you walk, listening to the imagined rustle of leaves, you realize something. Whether the gardens contained pomegranates or cedars, vines or lilies, the magic lies in imagining the scent of paradise drifting across the desert air. You pause, pluck an invisible blossom, and smile. The exact species may never be known, but the idea is enough. You step higher still, your sandals brushing against phantom petals, until the terrace opens onto a wide platform. Here the air feels heavier, as though centuries of legends and myths linger like incense smoke. For the hanging gardens didn't just exist in bricks and leaves, they sprawled outward into stories, weaving themselves into the mythic fabric of the ancient world. To the Greeks, who first heard whispers of the gardens, they were less a feat of irrigation and more a vision of paradise on earth. Writers painted Babylon as an exotic land where kings bent rivers to their will and where the impossible, trees hanging in the sky, was simply routine. For a people who loved tales of heroes and gods, the hanging gardens fit neatly alongside Olympus and Atlantis. Later, Roman authors layered their own embellishments. They described terraces as vast as mountains, shaded walkways cooled by mist, and exotic animals prowling among the foliage like a royal menagerie. Imagine strolling through a shaded path only to find a peacock strutting proudly or a lion dozing under a palm tree. Did that ever happen? Almost certainly not, but it makes the garden sound like the ancient world's ultimate luxury zoo. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval Arab scholars picked up the story centuries later, sometimes blending it with tales from the Quran or biblical traditions. One account even suggested the gardens weren't in Babylon at all, but were a metaphorical image of Eden itself, where the first humans strolled before messing everything up with forbidden fruit. A bold claim, but not surprising. Humans love to recycle good stories. And of course, the Bible itself ties Babylon to grandeur and hubris. The Tower of Babel looms as a cautionary tale of ambition, while the city becomes a symbol of decadence in later Christian writings. The idea of the Hanging Gardens nestled into that narrative nicely, a place of beauty and wonder, but also of pride and excess. Historians still argue whether this moral overlay distorted how later generations described the gardens. Were they remembered as an actual structure or as a cautionary tale dressed in greenery? The myths spilled further, inspiring poets and painters across ages. By the Renaissance, artists sketched the Hanging Gardens as elaborate Renaissance palaces with fountains and domes, because naturally they imagined the past looked like their present. In the 19th century, Romantic painters splashed canvases with visions of waterfalls cascading down colossal arches, queens in flowing robes wandering through groves of roses, and Babylonian kings brooding under palm fronds. None of it accurate, all of it intoxicating. You pause, leaning against a balustrade, and imagine the myths layering one atop the other like the terraces themselves. First, the Greek storytellers, then the Romans, then the medieval dreamers, then the Renaissance visionaries. Each generation added its own leaves and blossoms until the original branches were almost invisible. The gardens became less a place and more a mirror, reflecting whatever people most longed for. Historians still argue whether there's any separating the myth from the masonry, but maybe that's the point. Myths aren't falsehoods, they're truths of a different kind. They tell us not what was built, but what people needed to believe was possible. The Hanging Gardens whispered of paradise in the desert, of kings who could command heaven's bounty, of homesickness soothed by love, of rivers that climbed mountains. And as you stand here bathed in moonlight, you realize myths themselves are gardens. They grow, they spread, they take root in our minds. They hang between reality and dream, just like the terraces once hung above the desert floor. You wander deeper into the dream, past shadowy archways and the faint trickle of water echoing like a lullaby. Now your mind shifts towards something even stranger than myths, modern reinterpretations of the Hanging Gardens. Because while the ancients left us scraps of rumor, modern people, archaeologists, artists, novelists, have rebuilt the gardens over and over again in imagination. In the 20th century, as archaeology gained momentum, scholars began sketching blueprints of how the terraces might have looked. Picture massive vaulted brickwork rising like stair-stepped mountains, each platform layered with soil thick enough to anchor full-grown trees. Pipes, channels, and pumps crisscrossed behind the scenes, like the backstage rigging of a Broadway show. To some, it looked less like a palace garden and more like an industrial greenhouse designed by engineers in sandals. By the mid-1900s, popular books and history magazines were plastered with reconstructions. Some showed waterfalls spilling down the sides, Others depicted pyramidal terraces climbing higher than city walls. School children flipped open their encyclopedias and saw paintings of Babylon crowned with greenery. For an entire generation, the gardens were as real as the pyramids, because the pictures said so. Never mind that no one had ever found a single root pit in Babylon's soil. Here's a quirky tidbit. In 1954, an architect proposed that the gardens weren't gardens at all, but cleverly disguised agricultural terraces to grow food for the palace. In other words, history's most famous wonder might have been a glorified veggie patch. Imagine the disappointment of Amytis if, instead of roses and cedars, she found herself surrounded by onions and chickpeas. Romantic, not so much. Yet modern artists didn't care about onions. They doubled down on the lush paradise angle. Hollywood films set in the ancient world often included shots of rooftop jungles. Video games like Assassin's Creed or Civilization rendered the gardens in glowing detail, allowing players to stroll through pixelated vines. Historians still argue whether this pop culture imagery helps or hurts. On one hand, it keeps the wonder alive. On the other, it cements visuals that may never have existed. Meanwhile, archaeologists have become cautious storytellers. Some insist the Nineveh theory is stronger. Others hold out for Babylon. And then there are those who shrug and say, "We'll never know, but isn't the mystery fun?" You imagine them at conferences, sipping coffee and debating irrigation pumps like sports fans arguing over who really won a controversial game decades ago. In the 21st century, digital reconstructions have taken over. VR headsets now let you walk through the hanging gardens, hearing birdsong, watching water cascade, and brushing against simulated palm fronds. The irony, of course, is that the most vivid version of the gardens we've ever experienced may be the one created not by Nebuchadnezzar or Sennacherib, but by coders in a studio. The ancient dream reborn in pixels. And maybe that's exactly right. The hanging gardens were always half real, half imagined. Each age has rebuilt them in the medium it knows best. Clay tablets, parchment, oil paint, cinema, computer graphics. You take a deep breath and the thought settles warmly. Maybe the gardens hang not only in stone terraces, but also in the scaffolding of human creativity. As you step forward, the terraces around you ripple slightly, like pixels glitching at the edge of a VR scene. For a moment, you're not sure whether you're standing in Babylon, Nineveh, or inside someone's rendering on a gaming PC. And then you laugh softly, because maybe the distinction doesn't matter. The wonder survives either way. You linger beneath a vaulted arch where the air smells faintly of damp earth and stone, and your thoughts begin to turn toward legacy. What lasting shadow did the hanging gardens cast across time, aside from mystery and debate? Because even if the bricks have vanished, the idea still blossoms in unexpected places. Take medieval Islamic architecture. Many palaces and mosques incorporated lush courtyards filled with fountains, trees, and flower beds. Scholars suggest these designs were partly inspired by ancient Mesopotamian ideals of paradise. The walled garden as heaven on earth. Stroll through the Alhambra in Spain or the Persian gardens of Shiraz, and you can almost feel echoes of Babylon's terraces. Cool shade, trickling water, symmetry. It's as though the ghost of the Hanging Gardens whispered through generations of architects. Then there's the way the story shaped Western imagination. Renaissance scholars, rediscovering classical texts, placed the Hanging Gardens firmly among the Seven Wonders. Painters, mapmakers, and poets celebrated them alongside the pyramids and the lighthouse of Alexandria. Even though nobody had proof, the gardens became an anchor in the shared picture of antiquity. Historians still argue whether their inclusion was more cultural inertia than evidence, but the label stuck, and it elevated Babylon's reputation for centuries. Here's a quirky tidbit. In the 19th century, when European explorers carted Mesopotamian artifacts back to London and Paris, some wealthy Victorians tried to recreate their own hanging gardens. Roof gardens appeared atop hotels and private homes, complete with exotic ferns and fountains. Of course, their biggest problem wasn't irrigation, it was pigeons. Less majestic than Nebuchadnezzar's vision, the influence spreads even further. Today, skyscrapers from Singapore to New York boast vertical gardens and green walls, marketed as futuristic innovations. Yet at heart, they're a return to the same dream, bringing greenery into places where nature doesn't easily thrive. The Hanging Gardens may well have been the prototype for every rooftop terrace and indoor plant wall you've ever seen on Instagram. Ancient wonder turned lifestyle trend, but perhaps the most enduring legacy is psychological. The story of the Hanging Gardens reminds us that humans crave beauty even in harsh landscapes, that rulers, lovers, and dreamers across time have poured resources not just into walls and weapons, but into flowers and shade. The gardens embody an eternal truth. Civilization isn't only about survival, it's about comfort, wonder, and the audacity to demand paradise in the desert. Historians still argue whether this legacy is based on fact or fabrication. If the gardens were never real, are we celebrating an illusion? Or does the power of the story itself grant them reality in another sense? You trace your hand along a cracked stone ledge and wonder if legacies need roots at all, or if some thrive best as vines, clinging to imagination. The night air stirs, carrying the scent of phantom blossoms, and you realize that whether or not the Hanging Gardens ever stood, they continue to live, woven into architecture, art, and the simple joy of planting something green where it doesn't belong. That's their true inheritance, the persistence of the dream. You walk slowly now, as though your feet know this is the final stretch. The terraces around you shimmer, half real, half memory. Water flows somewhere unseen, and the sound makes you drowsy, like a lullaby drawn across centuries. Your mind turns toward the enduring mystery itself, the unanswered questions that keep the Hanging Gardens alive in conversation long after stones and roots have crumbled to dust. Archaeologists keep digging, yet the earth is stubborn. Babylon yields temples, walls, lion statues, but not the foundations of a sky-high garden. Meanwhile, Nineveh tempts with its aqueducts and Assyrian inscriptions, but even there, gaps remain. Historians still argue whether Amytis ever existed, whether Nebuchadnezzar really built anything for her, or whether the entire saga is a patchwork of Greek imagination. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some modern theorists propose the hanging part wasn't about suspension at all, but about overhanging terraces, an ancient linguistic hiccup that snowballed into centuries of misunderstanding. In other words, the hanging gardens might have been the shady balconies of Babylon. Less glamorous, sure, but historically plausible. And yet, maybe the absence of certainty is the point. Humans are drawn to gaps in knowledge. A perfectly solved puzzle loses its magic, but one missing piece lingers in the mind forever. The hanging gardens are that missing piece, a story that demands retelling because it cannot be fully explained. Think about it. If archaeologists suddenly found undeniable ruins tomorrow, mapped every irrigation pipe, and carbon dated every tree root, the mystery would vanish. You'd know the who, the where, the how. But you'd lose the shimmering uncertainty, the freedom to imagine waterfalls cascading through Babylonian sunsets or terraces swaying in Assyrian breezes. Sometimes not knowing is better. You lean against a warm stone wall, vines curling at your shoulder, and in the silence, you feel the hanging gardens less as a place and more as a rhythm, a reminder of how humans dream, how they tell stories, how they plant hope in impossible soil. That is the wonder itself, not the bricks, not the roots, not even the fountains, but the audacity to imagine paradise where none should be. The terraces fade as you breathe deeper, the sound of water slowing, the air thick with twilight. You close your eyes and the gardens hang not in Babylon, not in Nineveh, but inside you. And now let everything soften. You've wandered through ruins, myths, and mysteries, and your mind deserves to rest. The stones beneath your feet grow warm and hazy, dissolving into the background like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. The vines no longer climb, they simply sway gently, as though the whole world has slowed to match the rhythm of your breathing. The hanging gardens, whether real or imagined, are quiet now. No clatter of pumps, no debates of historians, no chatter of tourists with cameras. Just stillness, a terrace stretching out toward the horizon, where the last traces of sunlight melt into indigo. A single bird crosses the sky, then vanishes. You notice the air is heavy with the scent of night blossoms. Sweet, cool, calming. Each inhale feels slower than the last, as though your lungs are drinking in peace. And with each exhale, you let go, first of the unanswered questions, then of the stories, then of the day itself. The gardens no longer demand your attention. They cradle it. You are a guest here, safe, unhurried, allowed to drift away. If the hanging gardens ever truly stood, they are still standing now in your imagination, in the whisper of ancient water, in the hush between heartbeats. And as you surrender to that hush, the terraces grow softer still, dissolving completely until all that remains is quiet. A quiet so deep, it feels like a gentle tide carrying you outward, away, into rest. So let go. Let the gardens hang above you like a dream you don't need to solve, only to feel. And sleep deeply, knowing that some wonders are meant not for answers, but for dreams.